Welcome to Navigating Receiverships, a podcast from the Commercial Receivers Association, focused on building a better understanding of what brings companies into receivership, what happens in receivership, what makes them unique, some alternatives to receiverships, and ultimately, what happens to the business as the receivership is closed out. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Morcheski, CRA board member and CEO of Nimble Strategies. We're here today with Thomas Halm, principal at Offit Kurman. Did I pronounce that correctly?
You did.
All right, even better. So Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and experience?
Sure. I'm an attorney, graduated from Seton Hall Law here in New Jersey, and have worked for the last 30 years in creditors' rights matters, where I usually represent hedge funds, banks, and folks like that in cases. And I have a separate subspecialty in receivership cases that I developed years ago and have continued to work on over the years.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your firm.
Sure. Offit Kurman is AmLaw 200 firm centered out of the Baltimore, Maryland area in the New Jersey office.
So we're here today to talk about a Ponzi scheme case, your first case in receivership that you worked on. Tell us a little bit about how the Bureau of Securities came to you guys and what brought them to come to you about this company in particular.
Sure. The New Jersey Bureau of Securities had reached out to one of my partners. They had some experience with him in the past. He had done a little bit of work for them on another case. And they had said to him that they had a complicated case that they really needed some help with because it had been sitting for 2 years with nobody really taking a look at it because there was a question of jurisdiction. The federal government Securities Exchange Commission was potentially looking at this for a federal receivership action. And so the state government Bureau of Securities basically had to kind of take a back seat and wait until a decision had been made. So while that 2 years had gone on, many of the assets that the Bureau of Securities was aware of had been dissipated. So they were looking for somebody who could help find assets and bring them back for the defrauded investors and creditors who were really, out of money at this point. This was a very large securities Ponzi scheme that had predated the Madoff case. And so it was high profile, but it was also, there was no discernible assets left at that point after 2 years.
Well, that has to create some challenges for everyone involved, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It took about 2 years, but in that 2 years, by the time finally the Fed said, "Nah, we're not interested," everything was gone. Our guy was in jail. All of the assets had been moved. He had this very large house here in New Jersey behind gates. One of the things that we had found out while we were starting to investigate of this was that the wife had a yard sale, which would never happen in a place like this, but literally she sold the yard. She had landscapers come to the house and they rolled up the sod and they like literally uprooted the trees and like she sold every single thing that she could find and then just basically carted herself back home to Michigan, and she opened up a interior design store in Michigan where she was selling the contents of her house out of the interior design store. And it was the craziest case because at the beginning we had no money, right? This was a closed down corporation. And there was this thought process that we had, it was one of the larger receiverships here in Jersey. We had tons of defrauded investors and creditors who were demanding something, but everything that you would kind of look at was gone. Bank accounts closed, and everyone just kind of moved on. And so it became where we had to figure out a little bit like, if you were a criminal, what would you do? Where would you put the stuff? Where would the things go? And, think creatively about how, assets have been secreted, talk to everybody. There was a lot of, angry folks who were more than happy to kind of spill the beans on the nonsense that had gone on. And, the result of that case was we spent years kind of digging through it, and it was for a little while, it was a little bit dangerous, right? You have all of your billable time, tied up in a case where if you can't find any assets, you're in trouble. And we managed to, basically bring back into the estate, several $1 million, which, although it wasn't a lot, it was enough to at least get, a double-digit return to the investors and creditors. But all of it was hidden. And so it's a little bit talking about how we found that stuff. Working with other professionals. This particular wife ended up filing a no asset Chapter 7 in Detroit. So I worked with the Chapter 7 trustee to show him that we literally found, we had no idea. We knew that she had moved to Detroit. We knew about the yard sale from talking to various folks, but we had ended up, I literally had my paralegal call every moving company in Bergen County, New Jersey, and say, see if you can find, somebody had to move her, right? She didn't throw all the stuff in the back of her station wagon and head off to Detroit. And we eventually found the moving company, subpoenaed the manifest, found all the records, because they, of course, did the boxing up. So we knew everything that was in every box that had moved out there. And got the court to give us, the bankruptcy court actually gave us a civil search warrant, which, not the easiest thing to get in the world. But we showed up with the U.S. Marshals at this woman's house. As an aside, she wasn't home because she was now dating a mobster out in Detroit, and she was hospitalized because her breast implants had exploded in Las Vegas. So we were out at her house with her mom and her children, doing a complete inventory of the entire house. And at that point, the mother said to us, I don't know why you're harassing my daughter when his mother has a whole bunch of stuff at her house. And so the result of that was we came back to Jersey, got the equivalent from a civil search warrant from the New Jersey Chancery Court judge, who let us do the same thing at the mother's house. When we arrived at the mother's house with the state troopers, the mother was on the phone with the bad guy. And I overheard her say, as we were kind of searching the house, Tommy, they haven't found the secret room yet. And so, like, literally, I had turned to her, like, Mrs. Giacomaro, where is the secret room? And like, very dramatically, she's like, it's in the basement behind the bar. And sure enough, there was a secret room in the basement behind the bar, where he had everything that he owned kind of stashed away behind the bar. Some of it was just kind of good fortune. But a lot of it was kind of thinking creatively about where things could be. Looking at the bank accounts, really kind of working with your other professionals, your forensic accountants, your other attorneys, kind of being thoughtful about where things could be, because it often is not the way, nothing is what it appears in these type of receivership cases. And from that, I really kind of learned that applies really across the board, even in, kind of the non-criminal receivership cases I've been involved in, not accepting things at face value. It would have been very easy for us to say to the Bureau of Securities, all the assets have been dissipated. There's no chance that we're going to get any money back from this. So let's just, do a quick report, close it out. And, these folks will end up getting screwed, but they've been screwed already. We took a risk and it paid off really big for the firm, but even better because we were able to get money back for these poor defrauded investors and creditors. And it was a classic Ponzi scheme. Although classic Ponzi scheme in that he had an office building with his name, emblazoned on the outside of it. He had, 50 employees who were working every day, crunching numbers, and everything was fake. All the information that these people were crunching was fake. And all the data was fake, but it looked really real. And so you're sitting there going, what could have happened to this stuff? And then you realize it just never really existed. Every dollar that came in, he basically, went back out to him and into his pocket. It was a fascinating case, and I always wonder, is that the type of thing that is valuable to other receivers and
I mean, I think how
professionals?
you're finding assets obviously applies, like you said, beyond a Ponzi scheme to commercial receivership, because even when someone's not trying to hide something,
Sure.
there is assets there, to your
Yep.
point, and how you go about finding them. I mean, the one thing that goes through my head, even as you talk through all of that, was if you come up empty, you took on a big risk, obviously your firm did, because
Sure.
there's no money to pay yourselves.
That's right.
Um, and a lot of people probably would have been like, if there's no money here, like I ain't gonna do it.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you, when my partner, who was the receiver, needed to explain to the managing partner of our office that we were going to take this on, and there was a chance that the work could result in a big write-off. The managing partner was not real thrilled with that. And
I
then,
can't imagine why.
I was still a relatively, I would say, not young, but youngish associate. I was like maybe an eighth year associate at that point. So it was just starting that part of the career where they're like, are you partnership type material?
Mhm.
And when my partner was like kind of looking around at the folks in our group and asking like who wants to get involved in this, almost none of the other attorneys in the group wanted to get involved. It was too risky, right? Because it's their billable hours that are
Yeah.
all at risk. But I said that, I thought this was really interesting. I understood what the risk was, but I said to him, I also understand the upside is tremendous. If I'm able, as an eighth year kind of associate, if you're going to let me play in this sandbox, let me just kind of take a look at a couple things, and we won't get too far down the road, but let me at least see what we can do. And we created like a little fund almost immediately. What happened was the first thing that I looked at was the house. There's this mansion that's now been foreclosed on. Like, what the hell happened there? What happened to the money from that mansion? And we found that two of the creditors, investors, somehow had walked away with mortgages on this house. Um, so they had invested the money with the company. When things were starting to look bad, they had persuaded our bad guy to give them mortgages after the fact. So their investments were, let's say 2 years prior to that. And then they had secured that no new money, no new consideration. And then the two of them had been so greedy and fighting over priority that the Chancery Court had allowed the foreclosure to go through, but the money was sitting in the court. And it was several $1,000,000. I think it was like $3 million at that point. So what I had done, and the kind of thought process that I came up with was that money is really for the benefit of all the creditors, not
Mhm.
these two creditors. And so I filed a motion to intervene in their foreclosure action because now the dispute was just over the cash. And I said to the Chancery judge that money should be set aside. They should file a proof of claim like any other investor that we're dealing with, and they'll get a pro rata share of this because we didn't think that they were really good secured creditors to begin with under the circumstances. It's very controversial, but the judge agreed with us. So that very first thing that we did resulted in money coming into the estate, and suddenly it became a lot easier for everybody because now we had a pot of money that we could use to fund everything. But for that first couple of months, while we were fighting, and my legal fees that I had spent were all at risk. And the result of that was a year later, as we were kind of now really involved in this case, they made me a partner. So I kind of leapfrogged a couple of my colleagues who had been with
Yeah.
the longer than me because I was willing to take a risk to help the
Yep.
partner who brought this case in. And it became it was a great opportunity for me. It was a good way to learn how to use the courts and use the tools that we have as receivers. But it was also professionally a good way to kind of learn that, okay, I'm taking a risk, but if you don't take a risk, sometimes you don't get the rewards either, personally
Yeah.
and professionally. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you had quite the case. I mean, exploding implants
oh my
to
God.
vindictive mothers and
Everything about this, Eric, everything about this case, like I could spend hours talking about all the twists and turns of it. And there was one point that the bad guy, we had to take a deposition of him at the prison. And so we sent one of our female attorneys who was working on the case with us because he refused to, he was very like hard ass. He was not going to talk to me, but she showed up with a donut and he was very willing to talk to her.
yeah.
And the information that she got was critical. Like, there was a point where he was like, I have an entire book about all of the feds knew what I was about, and I have a book that has all of the information about the feds not allowing this Ponzi scheme to occur as long as I was cooperating with them on something different. And I'm like, this guy's like a crazy person. And
Yeah.
then I ended up in his lawyer's office in Washington, D.C., going through boxes and boxes of documents, trying to find what was happening here. And sure enough, this book showed up in this box. At the bottom of the box, it was like a 3-ring binder with all of these paper pages in it. And I was like, of course, this guy's very dramatic. He's like, if you ever find that document, the FBI will kill you because they want to keep this a secret. And it
Yeah.
was complete nonsense. But he did have this entire binder filled with documents, which, still as a young attorney, you're turning there and go, oh crap, I just found this box
Yeah.
of documents. I ran off to the copy machine, I made a photocopy of it, and then, kind of moved away. But I had a wannabe mafioso threaten to kill me and my wife and children. I had to call my wife from a deposition saying, you need to get ADT out at the house right away. I want to increase our security system.
Yeah.
It was crazy. It was the craziest case that I had ever worked on. But in that craziness, I learned so much that I've been able to put into practice every time I'm working on a case. So, not accepting things at face value. Like you said, it doesn't have to be things intentionally, but
Hmm.
sometimes you don't know what you don't know when you're first walking in those doors to take control of the spot. So,
Yeah. So where else did you guys find money? I mean, obviously the house, you mentioned some stuff kind of, I don't know what was hidden in the secret room, but
yeah, in the secret room, we were so aggressive with everything. So, in both the wife's house, when you walked into the wife's house, and we had U.S. Marshals with us, when we walked in, the house wasn't really like a house. It was almost like a storage facility. So she had, I don't know, 10 crystal, like Schoenbeck chandeliers hung from the ceiling, from the
mm,
dining room straight down the hallway. And
like it was a showroom.
it was like a showroom for Schoenbeck chandeliers. And you're like,
Yeah.
this is insanity.
Yeah.
We went into her master closet and she had every type of expensive purse. And it was all highly organized. So in every bag that had a purse in it,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
Birkin, and she would have a picture of the purse on the outside of the bag. So she
Mm,
did, it
okay.
was like a
So she didn't
Polaroid
have to
picture.
open them up.
Didn't have to
Yeah.
open it up. All the shoes, all so like literally at one point we were conducting an online auction of their clothes, the shoes,
Hmm.
the purses, all of the clothes that we found, everything. Any way to bring even a little bit of money in was a way to do it. So we had opened basically, I don't remember, I don't think it was an Etsy shop, but it was basically like an Etsy shop where we
Hmm.
sold all of their belongings online. We found quite a few folks who had been involved in the scheme and money had kind of moved to them. Besides, the things that we lost were probably even worse. We had spoken to one of the wife's friends, and she had said that she had taken out of the house 3 large Louis Vuitton trunks, and this friend said it was filled with cash. and that this money.
Those trunks themselves go for like 100 grand a piece.
Yeah, I mean, the trunk,
They,
we found trunks.
the one reason I know that is the Olympics this year. That's what, like, they had those as part of the opening ceremony. So
Yeah,
they're talking about how expensive those trunks were.
yeah. The 3 trunks that were filled with the cash, allegedly filled with the cash. Eventually, when we were talking with her mother, she admitted that the daughter had sent the trunks to her boyfriend's house, and they were at her boyfriend's house. And so soon as, of course, we immediately sent demand letters and saying we want those trunks turned over. And the boyfriend then promptly broke up with this woman because there was too much heat going on. But as far as we understand, he claimed that there were no trunks. Like I said, he was kind of a mobster wannabe out in the Detroit area. And when we asked the girlfriend to sign a certification so that we could get maybe a civil search warrant, she was like, I'm not signing a certification. You want to get me killed? He'll kill me. So she refused. So we were never able to get the trunks or the cash back because we kind of knew that it was there, but I didn't have any evidence other than, a hearsay statement from somebody, and it wasn't enough to prompt the court to let us do that. But a lot of the money that ultimately came back was through professionals who had helped foster this particular Ponzi scheme.
Right.
The professionals who were writing up the PPMs for securities that were being kind of shown to everybody knew that Tom was really the brains and the person who was running the show. He had the corner office in this office building. They met with him. We had, proof in their records that they had met with him. But in those PPMs, the initial drafts had the wife as being the owner of the company, and subsequent ones had his childhood best friend, who was the CFO, as the person who ran the company. So those PPMs became kind of evidence number one against these folks because we were able to show that they had drafted these things. He could not be the legitimate face of this company because he had a prior criminal record for fraud, and so he basically was coming up with ways to hide it. And this particular law firm was happy to, smaller law firm, but happy to kind of turn the other way and help him create that process. But you have to be careful, right? Because you don't want to accuse them of something intentional, because then you lose the malpractice. So it was years worth of litigation, years of just kind of looking for money and relatives and things of that nature. But ultimately, it all worked out. And that started for a couple of years. We were kind of the go-to firm for the Bureau of Securities on these Ponzi scheme cases. We did, I think, over the course of that next couple of years, I probably did 4 or 5 of them, where either I was the receiver or I was lead counsel for the receiver. They liked how aggressive we were in finding things, and that goes a long way towards making the folks in the receivership case, these kind of defrauded investors, feel a little bit better. So,
yeah. What should others take away from your experience in this case?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest learning lesson for this case was that you need, in any type of receivership case, you need to think creatively about what you're looking for and where assets might be. In this particular case, we had almost no business records. We knew that there were some hard assets that had been dissipated, but we had no idea how to even find these things. And so it was kind of think creatively. If you were the bad guy, what would you have done under that circumstance? For instance, the wife's moving company. We knew that the wife could not have moved out of that 5,000, 10,000 square foot mansion on her own, so she had to use something. And so just making those phone calls, spending the time to think, okay, how would this have happened, really resulted in us finding the first big piece of secreted assets, and it just kind of rolled from there. It turned into a real opportunity, but it's really about don't accept anything at face value, because often when you're dealing with these things, companies that are closing down, folks who are on the way out, nobody's really paying attention, and there leads opportunities to things being dissipated very quickly.
So should we all be concerned about how good you were at thinking like a bad guy?
Well, I hope not. But it worked out really well for the clients. I mean, we went from being able to say to the investors that there was going to be no distribution to making a double-digit distribution to these folks, which in these type of receivership cases, if you can get above 10%,
Mhm.
you're really making a great distribution back to the investors and creditors.
Yeah, because none of these Ponzi schemes are people just storing the assets somewhere, in a bank account that you can just go seize, right?
Correct.
It's not like when a company goes out of business and you're like, all right, we're going to liquidate the equipment and we know that's worth something. I mean, in these cases, it's everything's been blown through. So,
Yeah, everything's been blown through. And the things that are left behind are the things that have no value, right? We
mhm,
took control of an office building that the only thing, they didn't own the office building, it was
mhm,
rented. So I have a defaulted lease, and potential defaulted lease obligations that I've got to deal with. And, rows and rows and rows of, now multi-year old computers that
mhm,
have almost no value.
yep,
To get rid of that stuff, is almost valueless to the estate. It costs more to process.
mhm,
There was just nothing of value left. If this wasn't a manufacturing facility, it wasn't actually even performing any legitimate business to begin with. So we had a lot of computers and nothing to do with them.
yeah. Well, thank you. This has been great to hear this whole story. I think our listeners will enjoy themselves as they listen through everything here. You're definitely the first one to talk about exploding breast implants. That stuck out to me.
It was a strange case, and in the end, I was happy that we were able to turn the situation around for those defrauded investors and creditors. I always used, in my mind, I'd find one investor who I felt sympathy for, and there were so many stories that you would hear when people are filling out their proof of claim sheets. And in this particular case, I had a little old lady who had invested her entire life savings and who's now working at the Home Depot as a greeter because she no longer could afford anything, because this guy had basically, it wasn't a tremendous amount of money, but it was her life savings. And
Yep.
that became the person that I identified with. Like, if I can get this woman a little bit of money back,
Mhm.
then it would be all worth it in the end.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been great. I really appreciate your time here.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for joining Navigating Receiverships, brought to you by the Commercial Receivers Association. Find more information at commercialreceiver.org and catch every Navigating Receiverships podcast by subscribing through your favorite platform today.